question for you all. If you could save a child's life with 2 hours of your time, would you do it? I'm a specialist in bone marrow transplantation. I spend most of my days working with children who are very ill or who are dying. It's not an easy thing to do. So why have I chosen this path? And to explain that to you, I want to tell you about Helen. I first met Helen in 1984. I was 25 years old, I was a junior doctor, I was full of energy, full of enthusiasm, and almost no experience. Helen was 10 years old, and she came to the hospital because she was pale, she was tired, and she had little bruises all over her body. I liked Helen right away. She was quiet and reserved, even by British standards. And Helen was a good girl. She was the kid at the front of the class with the answer for the teacher, and that's who I was when I was 10. I saw myself sitting in the bed. Helen was brave. She only cried a little bit when the senior doctor and I told her and her parents that she had leukemia. We explained the plan for chemotherapy, and we explained that we thought that she would probably be able to get better. About 4 weeks later, a paper came in the mail, and it had Helen's name on it, and it said, positive for the Philadelphia chromosome. Well, I had no idea what that meant, so I went and showed it to my boss, and he said, it means she's going to die. And he explained to me that the Philadelphia chromosome marks a leukemia cell as very aggressive. He said she'll do well with chemotherapy, she'll go into remission, but it'll come back after about 6 months, and then nothing more can be done. And that is exactly what did happen. When Helen was dying, I would visit her every night on my rounds, and one night about 10 o'clock I looked in on her and said, is there anything you need? And she looked at me and she said very quietly and very politely, make me better, please. And I couldn't do that. I didn't know how. Nobody knew how. Helen died a few days later, very quietly, without a fuss, a very British death. And I felt that I had failed. But now, 30 years later, the majority of children with Philadelphia-positive leukemia can be cured with bone marrow transplantation. Bone marrow is an extraordinary organ. It's my personal favorite body part. And your bone marrow is a factory. It's the factory that makes the red cells, the white cells, and the platelets that constitute our blood. And it's an extraordinarily busy factory. So our blood cells are being broken down all the time. And our bone marrow makes 600 billion cells every day. So bone marrow transplantation is very different from transplantation of any other kind of organ. So with a kidney transplant, the surgeon clamps off the blood vessels, cuts it all out, moves it to somebody else, sews it in, takes off the clamps, and there you go. So it's kind of plumbing. With a bone marrow transplant, it's not quite that easy, because your bone marrow is all through your bones. It's the squishy bit in the middle of your bones. So you can't cut out a piece of somebody's arm and sew it into somebody else. That's not going to work. But what you can do is put a needle, rather a long needle, into the bone marrow, in the hips, and you can suck out the seed cells, the stem cells, that can grow a whole new bone marrow. So how do I plant these seeds? Well, these are amazing cells. Stem cells are the best. So firstly, they know where to go. I can put them back into a child who needs them through an IV. It swims around in their body, it finds the bone marrow in all these different places, sits down and starts to grow a whole new organ in place. So if a kidney transplant is plumbing, bone marrow transplant is kind of gardening. We plant them and they grow. Stem cells are cool in many other ways. So one important thing about blood stem cells is that they are immortal. Think about that, they are immortal. When these stem cells sits down and starts to grow and make a whole new bone marrow, divides into two, one of those daughter cells goes off and makes blood cells, but the other one is a stem cell itself. It's replaced itself. So bone marrow is a renewable resource. When I collect bone marrow from somebody for a transplant, and sometimes I take a pint from people's hip bones, they replace it within about 3 weeks. It is back. I could take it again if I wanted to. So how cool is that? So this sounds kind of magical, and then maybe even rather easy. But there's one big fat fly in the ointment, and that is that you can't take cells from one random person and put them into another person. They have to be tissue matched. And all our cells have proteins on the surface, and these are like little labels that say whose cells they are. And these need to be matched, or the whole thing won't work. So the best place to find a match is within our families. So for any of us, there is a 1 in 4 chance that any one of our brothers and sisters would be a match with us. So that's great. But in the 70s and 80s, the only way we knew how to do a bone marrow transplant was between brothers and sisters. Most of us don't have 6 or 7 brothers or sisters. Many of us have 1 or 2, some of us have none. So that most kids who needed a transplant didn't have a donor, but they were out of luck. In the mid-80s, a British woman called Shirley Nolan had a young son, her only child, who had a bone marrow disease that could only be cured by transplant. He's an only child, he was out of luck, there was going to be no donor. And Shirley was a very forceful woman, not a woman to be trifled with. She said, okay, nobody in the family, I'm going to go out and find volunteers to do this. And she started a registry, a computer file of people who agreed to get their tissue typed, put it in the computer, and say they would do this. This was a big success in many ways. A lot of people joined this British registry, and a lot of children's lives were saved. For Shirley herself, it was a failure. She never found a donor for her own son, and he died at the age of 8 of his marrow disease. After Shirley started this, the idea of bone marrow registries spread all around the world, and registries became very big, and they need to be big. We know of as many as 23 billion possible tissue types, so you need to have a lot of donors to ever find a match. So when you have many donors, you need to bring people together from all around the world. And registries around the world have formed a website called Bone Marrow Donors Worldwide, where I can simply, right here in Cincinnati, type in a child's tissue type, and there I am searching 24 million people. I'm searching people in Japan, Australia, China, people in all of those places who've agreed to do this. The US registry started in 1986, and it started in the face of significant opposition. The government said that people will never do this for people that they don't know. This proved to be wrong. We now have 11 million people registered in the United States, and tens of thousands of those people tens of thousands of those people have matched and donated stem cells. So we truly can depend on the kindness of strangers when we need something as big as a bone marrow transplant. I mentioned to you worldwide bone marrow donation. This is another cool thing about stem cells. They can survive outside of the body for as long as 2 to 3 days. So they can travel, they can take airplane rides. So when I match with a donor that lives in another country, we collect the stem cells where the person lives, we put them in a plastic sterile bag, they're hand carried, we don't let them fly alone. But they come here to Cincinnati, and then we can give them to the children who need it, right up there at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. The donation of stem cells from strangers is done anonymously. And we do this on purpose so that people don't get coerced into doing something they don't want to do. The bone marrow transplant donation is quite a big deal. There are 2 doctor visits, there is a lot of blood work, and then there can be as long as 2 hours, and this is where 2 hours comes from, in the operating room, getting the stem cells collected. So that's a lot to ask of anybody, so it needs to be an altruistic gift. But if things go well, a year after the transplant, the donor and the recipient can meet each other. And you can imagine that can be quite an emotional event. I remember this particularly well with my patient Kyle. Kyle was 17 years old when he was diagnosed with leukemia. He got chemotherapy, it didn't work, he didn't go into remission. He got the strongest chemotherapy we had and no response. So the only thing that could possibly save him at that point was a bone marrow transplant. We entered the registry, we found a donor, the donor put their life on hold, we got the stem cells, he had the transplant, and it went really well. The leukemia cleared away, he went back to normal teenage life. About a year after the transplant, he was in the clinic, and I asked him and his family, did they want to meet the donor? And his dad was crying when he said to me, what would I say? What do I say to somebody who stepped up and saved my son's life without even knowing who he was? A week later, the donor sent in their paperwork, and I was able to send the phone number to Kyle and his family. The next time Kyle came to clinic, I asked him how it went. And he said, well, it was weird. I said, what do you mean it was weird? And he said, well, my dad dialed the donor's phone number. But as soon as the donor picked up the phone, my dad just cried. He cried and cried, and he couldn't say anything at all. And I said, well, that's not weird. You know your dad's very emotional about this. And he said, no, that wasn't the weird thing. He said the weird thing was the donor knew right away who was calling. So seeing change like this in my lifetime, seeing a disease that's universally fatal, going to a disease that most people will survive, is astonishing and very humbling. But I want to tell you that the kids who stay in my mind, who are wedged in a little special part of my soul, are the children who are lost, the children like Helen. And we do them honor by doing a little better each day. So here I am, 30 years later, still trying to do a little better each day, still trying to make it right for Helen. So if you can save the life of a child with 2 hours of your time, will you do it? Thank you.